Hey guys, this is Julian of Julian Gray Media, and the other day when I posted my Serum tutorial on making a dead mouse pluck, you can click on that above me. One of my subscribers wanted to know the basics of a synthesizer, and I've never actually covered this before, and it's something that's often overlooked throughout YouTube and beyond. You know, like people always make videos like how to make this sound in Massive or this sound in Serum, but they never teach you exactly what a synthesizer is and how it works. If you see right here, I don't even know if you can. Let me see if I can aim. That is a traditional synth. It's a 1979 Korg MS-10, and surprisingly enough, we have continuously followed a traditional kind of similar pattern since back then. This old school thing is essentially, when paired with one of these, which is a sequencer, it's essentially a DAW with a VST. And we've kept the same format for over 30-40 years. So once you learn one synth, you should be able to apply any knowledge you learn from it to any other synth you may have or may look into in the future. So what we're going to do today, as you can see, I'm in Ableton here. We're going to go into one of my favorite synths, the new Serum VST from X for Records, and I'm just going to explain everything and what they do. So this may be a longer video. I encourage you to watch the entire thing. If not, just watch as much as you can, because I'm going to be teaching you a lot. Cool. So let's just disable everything right now. Actually, everything is already disabled. So what you see here is something called Oscillator A, or OSC-A. Whenever you see OSC, it means oscillator. Whenever you see VCO, it means voltage controlled oscillator. Whenever you see DCO, it means digitally controlled oscillator, etc. Now, if you've ever seen those fans that go back and forth, and it's called an oscillating fan, it means that it's essentially generating a back and forth motion. And an oscillator is essentially generating a back and forth motion in a sound wave. Now, if you've ever seen a sound wave up close, I'm sure you have if you dealt with audio tracks before. It's essentially a wave going up and down and up and down. I'm sure you've seen like those old movies and stuff where it shows like in science, mad science labs and stuff, it has like this waveform going through an oscilloscope. An oscilloscope is a device we use to watch oscillations in waves. And the wider the waves, if you took physics, the farther distance between the first peak and the second peak, like if this is a wave and this is a wave, is the frequency. And the closer together the frequency, the higher the pitch. So, an oscillator generates a waveform, like I was saying, according to a frequency you set. So the first thing we're going to look at is the octave. Now, an oscillator essentially takes these these different frequencies, and it automatically picks out which frequency is which note, because you know, if I was to just take a waveform and stretch it, it would be more like a pitch bend because it's not steps. An oscillator automatically takes each one of these increments along that waveform stretch, and each one of them that is a note, it assigns to an octave or a semitone in a plugin. It's not the same with old school synths, which actually you have to tune yourself, and they tune drift and pitch drift. But with digital synths like this, you can always count on it to be 100% accurate. So if we just play a note here, it's a little bit loud. Turn that down a little. Oops. That is I'd say a mid-range note. And if we actually look at the waveform, you can't do that in Ableton. You can do it in FL Studio. You would see a moderately spaced wave, you know. And as we go up, those waveforms are getting closer and closer together as the frequency goes up. This is easily demonstrated on a EQ, and an EQ follows a similar pattern here. If we go on here, and these are the higher frequencies, we're looking at 10K or 10 kilohertz and then 100 hertz. The higher we go, the higher the frequency is. And the higher the frequency is, the higher the pitch is. So if we look here, we're hitting at around the mid-range, and as soon as we go higher and higher, the waveforms are getting closer and closer together, and we are getting a higher frequency and a higher pitch. So when you're looking at an oscillator like this, when you jump an octave, it jumps an octave of pitch, or an octave of wave separation, and we get really high notes. If we go down, we can get really low notes. And as you can see, they're hitting at lower and lower frequencies. As I said before, a frequency is the distance between this peak of the wave and this peak of the wave. It's kind of hard to understand without a visual cue. Let me actually go in Serum here and get a sine wave out. So if we take a, let's see if we do a, it's not going to work. Like this, for instance. The distance from here to here is a frequency, is the frequency of the wave. Now if we move this over like this, you're going to get higher and higher pitch. So I hope that illustrates it a little bit better than this. And if you really want to learn more about this, I recommend taking physics in school, or just looking into the physics of sound. So that's what an oscillator does. Now a semitone is a set step, just like an octave, but it's 12 steps in between each octave, as we know, and each of those steps is a semitone. So the oscillator essentially assigns each one of those frequencies to a different step. If we put it in a audible frequency here, it sounds like you're playing a keyboard up and down, because that's essentially what a semitone is. Every note on the keyboard is a different semitone. A fine tune, on the other hand, bypasses that step. So instead of going from this waveform and jumping to this one just to do, like, say, a C to a D, it's going to just fade in between the two, just like a traditional synth, and it essentially is a pitch bend. So if we go, and then reset that control, and then the coarse bend is essentially the same thing, but the coarse kind of has more of a step to it. It's a different way of changing the frequency of the oscillator. This is a sine wave. A sine wave is the basic shape of a waveform. We also have a saw wave, a triangle wave, and a square wave. They all generate different kinds of sounds. We have the square, we have the triangle, we have the saw, and we have the sine. So on top of this, we also have the noise wave, which is not in the basic shapes. We'll get to that later. So that is the basics of the oscillator. PWM is something we call pulse width modulation, and that has to do with FM synthesis, and we won't get into that in this video because that's advanced. So now that you know what an oscillator is, it's fairly easy to understand that we have two oscillators here. We can enable a second one, and then they layer together according to the volume of each side. So this one is at, I'm going to put it up an octave, and they're at equal volumes. So if we play it together, you can hear a little bit of this triangle, or I'm sorry, I don't even know what waveform this is. I guess it's kind of like a saw and then a sine together. And if we turn that sine down, or the saw down, you can start to get the sine back. And this is very, very high frequencies, as you can hear, because we have it bumped up an octave. The next thing we're going to look at is the unison. Now, on a synth like this, like I pointed out before, the Korg MS-10, there's only one oscillator in the entire thing, and that's a monophonic oscillator. Now, when you're saying monophonic, it means that the synth only has one voice. If you press a key on the keyboard and try to press a second one, the second note will not play. That's because of the hardware limitations. Back in the day, you could only have one oscillator at a time in those old school situations. Or, by choice, the manufacturer only put in one oscillator to get more of a kind of a sliding note kind of feel. But the monophonic and the polyphonic are another word for unison. Unison is essentially the amount of voices you're using in each oscillator. So if we turn this unison up, we're at one voice right now. Let me disable oscillator B. We only get one voice. But if we do 2, we get 2. And you hear they start kind of phasing with each other a little bit. They're kind of out of tune with each other. 3, 4, 5. And in Serum, it makes it very easy to understand because it shows a line for each one of the different voices of the sound. So essentially, when we have the unison at 5, it's essentially 5 oscillators playing the exact same note. To make them sound separated, we use detune. So it takes each one of those oscillators and steps them off of a semitone just by a smudge. It essentially takes the fine tune and detunes it. So that way we don't get one solid sound with 6 of the exact same thing on top of each other. We get one sound in the middle, and then we get slightly detuned around it so it gets a little bit of a wider and more unique sound. So if we start to bring it to the center here, we get a single tone. If we start to widen it, we get more of that detune, and we get more of a wide tone. And the reason why it kind of like it goes in and out like that, like a sine wave, is something called frequency modulation, but we won't get into that in this video. Blend in Serum is a Serum only feature. It essentially makes the middle wave, the one that's not detuned at all, the yellow line, it blends it in with the rest or blends it out of the rest. So if we play it now, we're getting mostly the middle tone. If we play it now, we're getting all middle tone, and if we bring it up, we start to hear those detune more and more. So something to play with. The phase is where the oscillator will start playing the waveform. This is only the case in something called wavetable synthesis, like Serum, and I believe Harmer is one, and Massive. So those are the 3 main ones. And a wavetable is essentially we'll get into that in another video. It's too complicated. So that is the VCO. I think we've covered pretty much everything here. We have the pan, obviously, is left and right stereo. And this is only the case in Serum. So now that we've covered the oscillator and how frequencies work and how all of that works, we're going to get into the filter. Now, the filter is essentially a very, very, very sharp EQ. And you assign that up here. If you see this line caving down, it's essentially if we took a filter or an EQ here and brought this node down. And this is what we call a low pass, because the low frequencies of the sound are the only ones passing through. The high frequencies are getting cut out, which is the high cut. But as you can see right here, it says MG low 12. That means we're using a low pass filter. If we use this on the sound we're using currently, let's change this to something more noticeable here. Let's put it at a square wave. It begins to start carving out the top of the sound according to the cutoff frequency you set. So here we go. So essentially it's the same thing as taking an EQ and cutting out the top part of the sound. It just removes the high harmonics of the sound gradually rather than setting it static with an EQ. And you can get some really cool effects with the filter if you modulate it with something we like to call an LFO. Now, an LFO is something is essentially a very, very low oscillator. Now, as I said earlier, the lower the oscillator, the farther apart the peaks of the wave are. But if you separate these waves so far that they become kind of like musical with the actual BPM of the song, like say this is hitting every one beat or every quarter note of 128 BPM, you get something called a low frequency oscillator that is so low that you cannot hear it, and the only good it does is to modulate something else. So we use this kind of thing to generate these kind of like control waves almost. So if we take an LFO, for say, and modulate the cutoff of this frequency here, we get a moving frequency according to the LFO. So essentially, an LFO is a control frequency to control anything else you're doing. You can patch on old synths like this, you can patch in new synths like this, and it makes it very easy in Serum, as you can just drag this to patch to anything you want. So if you want to control the volume with this LFO controller here, we can do so. And that will follow the shape of this LFO. Now let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the filter a little bit. We also have something we like to call the high pass filter. It's the exact opposite of the low pass. As you can see, it cuts the low harmonics out of the sound as you raise the cutoff. And then we also have the band pass filter, which is essentially a band in the center of the frequency range that it essentially highlights when you highlight it with the cutoff frequency. Next thing we have to cover of a filter is something we call the resonance frequency. And essentially, the resonance pushes the end of the note. Okay, so if we have an EQ like this, and this is where the low pass starts going into effect and where it starts cutting. A resonance, all it does essentially is to boost the area right before the low pass goes into effect. So if we look over here at this waveform on this filter here, if we bring the cutoff down a little bit and raise that, let me change it to 12. Raise the resonance, it essentially boosts the section right before the filter goes into effect and brings down the other part. So if we give it a play here, it gives kind of a resonating effect. Another thing that we have on some filters is the drive. It essentially boosts everything behind where the filter begins use. So if it's a low pass, it filters everything, or I'm sorry, it boosts everything low in the harmonics, and if it's a high pass, it boosts everything high in the harmonics. So if we look at it, when we move it here, it gives the low a boost. That's the drive. And if we do a high, we get a high boost. So let's go to the low again and let's hear what that sounds. It's essentially a distortion kind of thing. We have the fattening, which is a Serum only thing, I believe, and that just I don't actually know. It thickens up the sound a little bit, but that's more of a programmed thing in Serum, and it's not actually part of the filter. So we have the filter and we have the oscillator. Next thing we're going to cover is the envelope. Now the envelope is something very important. With an envelope you have 4 parameters usually. You have the attack, the decay, the sustain, and the release. And then sometimes you have something called a hold. And essentially the attack is how long the note, or how long the envelope goes before it hits peak volume. So if we turn up the attack here, we can see that it boosts, it gradually goes up to the peak volume. The hold is the amount of time it stays at the peak volume. The decay is the time it takes to decay outward. The sustain is the amount of volume the decay is at when it hits the end of the decay, it goes into the sustain volume, and then the release is everything after that. So it is the amount of time it takes to fade out after the sustain. So again, the attack time sets the amount of time it takes to hit the peak volume. The hold time is the amount of time it maintains the peak volume. The decay is the amount of time it takes to go from the peak volume to the sustain volume. And the sustain volume sets that volume. And the release time is the amount of time it takes to go from the sustain volume back down to nothing. So if we play this sound here, we're going to control the volume, as envelope 1 in Serum automatically controls the volume. But if we set this back to the default here, let's put this up here, and this back to there, and go into the envelope 2, and we carve out something very interesting. Let's put a little bit of attack time, let's do a decay time very minimally, and let's do the sustain low, and let's turn that decay time down even more. Let's do an attack time a little bit less, and then let's do in Serum you can drag the envelope itself, which is very useful because you can't do that with knobs. And then we have something by modulating this filter with this envelope, by dragging this over here, just like we did with the LFO, we can make a shape for this filter to follow. So if we go and play, it hits very, very quickly because the attack time is low. If we bring that out, it takes a little bit longer. And you can essentially shape how you want your waveform to go over time with an envelope. And that is the use of an envelope. Now, as you notice, all these knobs look relatively similar in Serum, and they do in many other programs as well. That is because in digital synthesis, unlike the analog world, which is a huge flaw in the analog world, except for modulars, of course, you can patch anything to anything in digital. So if I was to want to modulate the pan for some weird reason, I can turn the pan all the way left and then modulate this, and then when it hits the top, it's going to hit here and then fade back down. I don't know if you can even hear that because it's such a weird abstract control. Let's bring that up, actually, and let's put that on the detune, let's say. So that's a really cool way to make some interesting sounds. Just experiment with envelopes and LFOs on the various parameters. You can also do that in the analog world, but to a much lesser extent. So let's jump back into that LFO for just a moment. We have the rate of modulation. It's essentially the same thing as a pitch on a traditional LFO, or I'm sorry, a VCO or oscillator, but in digital synths, they automatically snap to a grid of useful BPM or notation. So in this case, 1/4 note, 1/2 note, a bar, or etc. You can disable this and go back to traditional pitch by disabling BPM and just going to hertz. So as you saw down here when we were playing with this, we were hitting in, I'd say, the 200 hertz range and above when we were playing with the oscillator earlier. Now, as you can see right here, it's saying 7.2 hertz. That's very, very, very low. And as I said, the LFO is essentially just an oscillator that is playing at such a low frequency that we can't hear it. And that's why it's so useful to modulate other things. If we play this back and we turn this all the way up, we should be able to get a frequency out of it. Now, I don't know if Serum actually does this, but if we were to do it on a traditional synth and routed the output of the LFO, the control output obviously, to a amp, we can actually get sound out of an LFO if we turn up that frequency high enough to be audible by our ears. But the main use in an LFO is to modulate something else with low frequencies, because it's creating these really, really broad frequencies at a low speed, slow enough to use in a standard notation like 120 BPM. Cool. The next thing we have is porta or portamento. It's also known as glide, and this is a feature that was invented back in monophonic days, like this synth here. It's when the synth only had one voice, like I was saying earlier, and when I play two notes at the same time, it will essentially just jump between the two. It'll step really hard, like duh, 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 duh. What porta does is essentially it forces the oscillator to glide between the two notes, and the more amount of portamento time you put into the synth, the longer it'll take to fade between note 1 and note 2. If we enable always here to enable portamento always and play two notes when the porta is up, as you can hear here, we are actually getting like very, very long transfer times between the two notes. If we start turning that down, we start get a different effect. And all the way down we get the step like in a traditional synth. Now in digital synthesis, on analog synthesis, this would only be possible on monophonic synths, as it would only jump between notes if you forced it to do that. On digital, we have the Unison Control, and obviously we're using more than one oscillator at a time, but through code and through very technical engineering, we can add portamento to layered synthesis. So that's actually about all there is to VCOs, portamento, and LFOs, envelopes, filters, the basics of a synth. The only thing that we have left to cover, let me just make sure I've got everything here, is the amplifier. And everybody knows how an amplifier works. It just takes the sound and boosts the crap out of the waveform and makes it hit louder, essentially. So that's all there is to a basic synthesizer. I hope this video helped you. If you want to check out my videos on sound design, I'm starting a new tutorial series on that. You can click above me for that link right here. And if you want to learn how to write music like me and do so in Ableton Live 9, you can check out the link above me now. And yeah, I make a video every Wednesday, I make a video every Friday, and they can be blogs, they can be tutorials, unboxings, whatever. This is Julian of Julian Gray Media. I hope you liked this video if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it. Give me a subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. So thank you for watching. I will see you guys next week.